Okay, so we're all really looking forward to hearing from our Early Career Researcher Prize winners. And first up, we have the winner of the Early Career Researcher Award for Petroleum Geoscience, and that is Dr. Sian Evans from the University of Oslo. So at this point, I'm going to pass over to her, and we can all listen to her interesting presentation.
Yes, hi, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides now. Please shout if there's something wrong with my audio or the slides. But yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's really nice to be invited to share some of this work, and obviously a huge pleasure to receive this award from Petroleum Geoscience. So the title of my presentation today is Intrasalt Structure and Strain in Layered Evaporites, Implications for Drilling Through Messinian Salt in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, that's also the same title as the paper that this presentation is based on. So I, of course, can't go in detail through everything that is in this paper. We packed quite a lot in. So this is going to be a kind of whistle-stop tour overview of some of the key points of the paper. And that QR code in the corner there, if you scan it quickly, will take you to the full paper if you're interested. Okay, so with that, I will start. So giving an introduction then, our study was based on 3D seismic data from offshore Lebanon. So that's the location of those pink polygons that you can see in the figure there, located in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Messinian salt, for those unfamiliar, is one of the youngest salt giants in the world. It's only 5-6 million years old, so geologically very young. Very thick, and it is deposited across pretty much the entire Mediterranean Sea. And because it is so young compared to some other salt deposits that have been studied a lot offshore Angola, offshore Brazil, or the Gulf of Mexico, this gives us an opportunity to study salt in its very earliest stages of deformation. So it could be a good analog for the deformation of some of these more evolved salt deposits on other passive margins and other salt basins around the world. Because it is young, it's relatively weakly deformed as well. So we'll see that in a sec. And why bother studying this? Well, there's a few different reasons, but one of them is the fact that this is an area that is prospective for oil and gas deposits. And if you're going to access those in the subsalt, you will have to drill through the salt. Salt can move particularly fast. So salt behaves as a fluid on geological timescales, and it can move a couple of millimeters per year. So that can be quite annoying if you are drilling a borehole through a thick salt deposit, which you then hope to last for several years. It also has huge implications for velocity modeling because salt is particularly fast, and of course for structural trap implications as well. So the way salt deforms is very unique. As I said, it behaves more like a fluid, behaves in a ductile manner, and therefore has a big impact on the deformation of its overburden in general. So this is the general structure of the Levant margin. I'm just going to throw up the annotated version there so you can see a bit more clearly. But in general, you can see here that we do have this pink salt deposit, which is thinning and pinching out up dip. And we generally have this series of kinematic domains. So up dip in the overburden, you can see there's a whole series of salt detached normal faults. And as you move down dip, you can see particularly within the salt in this section that we have a lot of intrasalt reflectivity. And those intrasalt reflections are deformed themselves into folds and thrusts, so generally more compressional. But this this reflectivity within the salt, within the Messinian, is of course indicative that we have some lithological heterogeneity within the salt itself. So we don't generally have a very good handle on the composition of these intrasalt layers offshore Lebanon, but they have been drilled offshore Israel, where the stratigraphy looks very similar, and they seem to be more anhydrite rich towards the top, but also interbedded with clays and with diatomites and various types of evaporite and clastic materials interbedded within the overall halite rich salt layer. Okay, so having a look at some of these structures in aerial view then, this is the top salt surface, and you can just about see up dip that we have these normal faults, which are pretty much parallel to the margin. We have this zone, which is a bit more complicated, and that's where some early stage diapirs have started to penetrate the overburden. And then the resolution's not great, but hopefully you can see down dip that we have some of these folds here, which are trending almost in the same direction as those faults in the up dip domain. So those are our kinematic domains. And also if we look at one of those intrasalt layers mapped as a surface, this is a zoomed in version. So within the red polygon here, you can see that these also have a very distinct structural trend as well. So these are some of those folds and thrusts within the salt itself. And you can see that they pretty much everything here is aligned in this northeast southwest structural trend overall. So one of the first things we did was initially replicate a study that had been done offshore Israel a few years earlier than ours by Joe Cartwright's group, which is that they decided that these intrasalt layers would actually be really good indicators of strain within the salt itself. So what we can do is use a line length balancing technique and measure the strain on these different layers through the salt. If we take seismic sections which are then perpendicular to that overall structural trends that we can see. So we did that, measured strain on different levels within the salt, from these higher stratigraphic units to the middle and that lower unit at the base. You can see in some cases these units are truncated against the top salt surface, and I will come back to the significance of that observation, but where that does occur, we had to project those units in order to add back in that strain for our measurements. So flying through then, this was the initial results of these strain measurements. So in red, you can see the series of seismic sections that we took across the margin to try and analyze some trends for how that strain varies from north to south across the margin. So this top graph is very messy, but I'll just quickly point out that overall, we seem to have very low strains at the base salt and the overburden, those brown and blue horizons on the graph, and tend to have higher strains in the center of the channel, which are those yellow and gray lines on the graph. And overall, we see a trend of increasing strain towards the south, and we have this particularly high peak that you can see towards the south. And that relates to this particular structure. And in a few places, we start to see these points of much higher strain. And these are actually intrasalt thrust duplexes, essentially. So there are some points where clearly a lot of strain has been accommodated over a very short spatial scale. And we're not quite sure of the reason for that. It could just be that there was something mechanically weaker in the, in the deposition of these units that meant that they were more prone to accommodate strain in this particular area. But they are very local features, and then the strain tends to decrease away from those features. Looking then back to the vertical strain profile, which formed the basis for most of the discussion in this paper, what we tend to see is very similar to the results of the study offshore Israel that I mentioned earlier, which is that we tend to see maximum strains in the center of the channel, diminishing strains towards the top and the base. And so we could say, oh, maybe that's because our projections are bad and we're missing some strain. But even in the sections where we preserved the whole stratigraphic sequence and didn't have to project anything, we still saw this particular trend. So maximum strains in the center and then decreasing towards the top and the base. So we think that it could even be higher in the ductile units, because of course we're only measuring strain on those more brittly behaving units that we can map within the salt. And it's possible that we have even higher strains within the ductile units, which are more mysterious and harder to measure. So this is one physical model where they put some markers within the silicon, which are the analog for the salt. And they showed, that you can have higher strains within the more ductile units. But overall, this trend seems to be resembling a kind of Poiseuille flow profile. So that's where we have maximum velocities in the center of a confined channel, and then minimal velocities towards the top and the base. And of course, if our strain profile is truly representative of the strain within the system, then that means we've accommodated more movement in the center of the channel and less towards the top and the base. So perhaps this is representing a Poiseuille flow, which we typically associate with a system driven by gravity spreading. So this would be a system that is being squeezed up dip, and it's confined at its top and its base. And so it's pushing mainly in the center of the channel for this salt flow down dip. However, we do have some other features within the salt that give us an idea of the kind of stress state or the distribution of strain within the salt. And that is these fluid escape pipes. So you can see we have some kind of chaotic features within the salt in this seismic section that was first identified by Cartwright and his group. And they interpret these as fluid escape pipes, which form periodically and are then deformed by the moving salt after they've been formed. And then the pressure builds up and another one forms and that one deforms as well. And then you get this kind of series of fluid escape pipes from oldest to youngest. And so if we just treat these fluid escape pipes as direct indicators of the movement of the salt, well, they seem to be showing us something that resembles a Couette flow profile. So that's where we seem to be seeing the maximum velocity or maximum strains at the top of the channel, and then decreasing towards the base, obviously where the drag is much higher. And this flow profile is more indicative of a system driven by gravity gliding. So the overburden itself is pulling down dip, and essentially because the salt and the overburden are coupled, that is pulling the salt with it, and you get the velocities decreasing from the top to the base. So the question then is, of course, how do we reconcile these contrasting flow profiles? Why is our seismic strain profile seem to be indicating something completely different to our direct kinematic indicators, which are those deformed fluid escape pipes? Well, obviously, one of the big things is being a seismic study, we will be missing a significant proportion of the strain. So everyone who deals with seismic data has to battle with this at some point. But we are looking at a system here where we're dealing with very heterogeneous units, some behaving more ductile, some behaving more brittle. And we know that some of those structures are going to be below the seismic resolution, so below what we can actually image with seismic data. And this is some kind of, just to give you an idea of those types of deformation that we can see in such heterogeneous salt structures, some images from the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland. So you can see on the smaller scale, we get this kind of ductile folding and flow of the more halite rich and more ductile units. And then we can have some brittle units that are broken up and but forming very small thrusts and very small offsets that we wouldn't be able to image in seismic data. And then in the final image, you can see here, even if we do have a larger structure, which with luck we'd be able to image in seismic data, within that structure itself, you can see that the units are very broken, and we would actually be missing a lot of that strain, even if we could image that overall structure with the seismic data. But if we were missing the same proportion of strain at every level within our deforming salt, then that wouldn't be a problem because the overall trend would still be correct. But of course, if we do have very different, a very different bulk ratio of brittle ductile units towards the top than the base, for example, the way that that strain is accommodated in the salt would be very different at those different stratigraphic levels, depending on the different rheologies and the bulk brittle ductile ratio of those different units within the salt. So that might mean that that could throw off our seismic strain profile if we had units towards the top that were much more likely to deform in subseismic or ductile ways than the units in the middle. The other thing that can throw off this profile would be if we had multiple phases of deformation. And of course, we know that we do have that because, as I said, we have this truncation of the intrasalt units at the top salt. So we know that we've had at least two phases of deformation here. And I'll just quickly, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I will just fly through these final couple of slides because I think I'm running over a little bit. But essentially what we could have is an early phase of gravity spreading, followed by a later phase of gravity gliding. And that would mean that our fluid escape pipes, which only formed after the overburden was deposited, are only recording this later phase of flow, whereas the overall seismic strain profile would be recording that total flow. So that could be one reason why our seismic strain profile is not representative of the profile that these gas pipes are actually recording. So conclusions then, we do have this series of kinematic events in the Messinian. We see this contractional deformation that's formed in at least 2 deformation events. And we can see that the strain varies across the margin. It also varies vertically within the salt. And if we wanted to drill through the salt, so I don't have a lot of time to talk about the drilling now, but if we were going to drill through the salt and we wanted to drill the borehole with a trajectory that would account for the stress state within the salt, we obviously want to know what the present day stress state is within the salt. So that depends on us having a very good understanding of what the current drivers of gravity-driven deformation are, whether that be gravity gliding or gravity spreading. But rather than considering the whole history of salt deformation, which can vary through time and space, for a drilling operation, we need to have a good understanding of what's presently driving that salt deformation on the margin, which in this case appears to be a gravity gliding driven system. Okay, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sian.
I ran over a little bit.
Not a problem at all. I can't see any questions in the chat, so I wonder, do any of our panelists have any questions for Sian? I don't think so. Okay, well, keep your thinking caps on. If anybody has any questions, there will of course be time at the very end as well. So thank you very much, Sian. Really well done. And yeah, congratulations on winning our prize.
Thank you. And yeah, you can also email me if we don't have time in this presentation as well. Always happy to chat salt and seismic. So thank you.
Brilliant. I'm sure some people will take you up on that kind offer. Okay, on to our second prize winner, and that is the Early Career Researcher Award for the Quarterly Journal of Engineering, Geology and Hydrogeology, and that is Madeline Groves. So at this point, I'll pass over to Madeline.
Hi. Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen and hopefully do it correctly. Great. Yeah, I'll just same as Sian, it's a real pleasure to be here today and give a presentation and to receive this award. It is a paper that I co-authored with a couple of colleagues, so Joseph Burney and Dr. David Giles. And I'm going to be presenting today on the development of a ground model in an area of significant faulting and periglacial legacy in Royal Tunbridge Wells. So I'll start with just a bit of site context and a bit about proposed development at the site, and then move on to the requirement for a detailed engineering ground model, and then the process that we went through to develop that and how it fed into our analysis and design for the project. So the site is located in Calverley Square in Royal Tunbridge Wells. It's currently occupied by a nice big park area. It has a steep slope in the north area of the park. It has a multi-storey car park in the south area, as well as some open car parking up in the north. CGL, who I work for, we were on board on the project to provide a geological ground investigation as well as geotechnical analysis and design for the development. So that development was going to comprise mixed use buildings. So in the north of the site, a 7-storey office and civic suite, which would have 4 basement levels, which would be cut into the existing slope. And then in the south, the existing multi-storey car park would be demolished and replaced with a single level basement. And in the 4-story basement area, it would be retaining up to about sort of 12 meters of soil. So in our role as the geotechnical engineers on this project, we needed to build a ground model that would be able to, which would allow us to properly scope our ground investigation, as well as inform our detailed design and analysis at later stages of the project. And it would need to allow us to recognize any potential geotechnical hazards, ways to de-risk those and ways to investigate them. So it would form the basis for design and scope of our investigation, as well as the methods used and how we reviewed that data. So we went about building this model following the sort of approach recommended by the International Association for Engineering Geology, which involves a first conceptual stage, then moving on through an observational stage and site investigation, and then feeding those into the analytical stage of our design work. So starting with the conceptual stage, this would provide us, this would involve a review of the regional geological and geomorphological history, and that then narrow that down to a local focus on the current ground conditions on the site. So starting with that, we started looking at the strata that we should expect on the site. So you can see the position here. In the north, we would be expecting to see the lower Tunbridge Wells sand formation, underlain by the Wadhurst clay formation. And then a key feature of the site was that the Royal Tunbridge Wells fault transects the site roughly through the middle. And so on the southern side of that fault, we'd be expecting to see the undifferentiated Tunbridge Wells sand, with the Wadhurst clay formation underlying that at depth as well. For preparing our ground model, as well as preparing engineers to go out onto site, it was important to understand the depositional environment for those strata, so that we would know what to expect seeing the soils on the site. So the conditions that they're deposited in varied between marine and non-marine conditions, resulting in alterations of sand and clay dominated strata. So we've got a couple of examples of diagrams here showing the significant surface runoff in phase depositing more granular sand strata, and that surface runoff leading to braided alluvial systems. So also this generating quite a lot of lateral variability that we would expect to see within the strata. And then as this Londinian massive, as that eroded and downfaulted, it'd be moving more into fresh to brackish conditions with sluggish, muddy waters, resulting in the deposition of the clay-dominated strata. So, like I said, it would be important that we'd understand that there would be this lateral variation as well as vertical variation between the strata. Then moving on, another key feature of the conceptual model was understanding the structural history of the site. It's located in an area broadly characterized. It's located in an area characterized by broadly west to east trending faults. The Royal Tunbridge Wells fault that transected the site was expected to have a vertical displacement between sort of 7 to 13 meters down thrown to the southeast. So a key part of our observational phase would be looking for evidence and approximate location of that fault on the site, as well as trying to address the potential for additional faults in the north of the site. As well as these aspects, the site is also in an area which would have experienced periglacial conditions through the Quaternary. So you can see the sort of position approximately in region 5 of glacial limits here. So we would be expecting to see some periglacial landforms and the hazards associated with those on site. So we moved on to considering the type of land system that would have been present. So that would have comprised of a strong cap rock overlying much weaker strata, so Tunbridge Wells sand formation overlying the weaker Wadhurst clay formation. And we moved on to compiling a risk register of those potential periglacial structures and landforms, and then considering the impacts that they could have to the development. So key hazards that were identified included that there had been well-published slope failures within the Waterhouse Clay Formation, the potential for relic shear surfaces, and also structures associated with cambering. So these could have an impact on the proposed development through aspects such as slope failure events, or leading to excessive settlement or differential settlement for the proposed development. And having compiled those risks, we also considered mitigation measures. So that would be, of course, appropriate foundation design and analysis, but also training site engineers to recognise those features whilst they're in the field. So we've got an example here of one of the types of resources that they would have used, they used in the field whilst doing trial pitting. So looking for potential signs of relic shear surfaces. Now moving on to the observational phase. So this was developed as the proposed development scheme developed as well. So initially it was quite a loose plan of what would be constructed. And with that, we started with just 2 preliminary stages of site investigation, which would really to address general ambiguity across the site, with main focuses on the level of the Waterhouse clay in the north of the site, and potential for additional faults in that area, as well as gathering some more general conditions in the south of the site. We then moved on to as the development scheme was progressed. The first area of that they started wanting analysis and design work for was in the northern area. So our phase 1 investigation was scoped to really target that area, looking to de-risk the northern fault zone, as well as looking for the presence of relic shear surfaces through doing a series of trial pits down the slope. We then moved on to a phase 2 investigation, again as the sort of scheme development moved further south. So the phase 2 was more focused on contamination issues. And then phase 3, as the theatre development they were putting in the south progressed, there was a potential to look at value engineering from a secant pile wall around the proposed basement to a contiguous pile wall. So we were doing a more detailed review of the groundwater conditions in this area, as well as looking at in more detail around the depth of the undifferentiated Tunbridge Wells sand around the Tunbridge Wells fault on the south side. So some of the broad findings from the site investigation was that we did see what we were expecting in terms of strata. So in the north, we saw the lower Tunbridge Wells sand overlying the Waterhouse Clay Formation. In 1 or 2 locations, we saw a nice contact like this, so with the Waterhouse Clay Formation, and then at the boundary, some really noticeable iron staining, and we also saw water strikes at that boundary. There were quite a number of locations where we didn't see that nice clean-cut boundary, where either the rotary drilling got poor recovery at the sort of approximate level we were expecting that, or where there was significant interbedding, but that wasn't too surprising to us given the understanding of the braided river systems and potential for washout channels from those. In the south of the site, we encountered the undifferentiated Tunbridge Wells sand, which was as expected. We weren't able to prove the downthrow of the fault in that area, but we were able to get the depth that we required for the proposed development. In terms of groundwater, like I said, we regularly saw the strikes above the more cohesive Waterhouse Clay Formation, but generally we didn't see a single continuous groundwater table. It was more that we saw perched water bodies above cohesive horizons, both in the Tunbridge Wells sand and in the Waterhouse Clay. We did see evidence of periglacial soils, so we saw these as instances where we found low standard penetration testing results of an N value between 4 and 7, so indicating very soft to soft clay deposits. which were interpreted to be indicative of solid fluctuated head deposits. And also elsewhere we saw medium dense sandy gravels, which were again interpreted to be solid fluctuated deposits originated from the Tunbridge Wells sand. So those were important to feed into the design work to raise the potential for relic shear surfaces in those areas. In our locations that were close to the Tunbridge Wells fault, we did see highly fractured and deformed rocks in our boreholes with possible fault gouging in some. Like I said, we proved that the undifferentiated Tunbridge Wells sand was present to at least 9 meters, to have a down throw of at least 9 meters, but we didn't prove the top of the Wadhurst clay formation. But that was sort of around the down throw that we were expecting based on the literature. So having gathered that observational data, we incorporated it into our ground model, and then we moved on to carrying out the geotechnical design. So I outlined the proposed development in the north earlier, and that significant slope that significant cut that was being created in the slope on the site, that would be retained by a secant pile retaining wall with retaining up to 12 meters, and that would provide cut-off water down the sloping surface of the cohesive Wadhurst clay and those other and to those other purged water bodies above the cohesive layers within the Tunbridge Wells sand. In the south, the excavation was going to be only about 3 meters deep, and like I said, originally was planned with a secant pile wall, but we did start to look at the possibility of value engineering that to a contiguous wall. And CGL, so in our role, we provided many aspects of design analysis, including ground movement assessments, designs for secant pile retaining wall, the king post walls allowing temporary works, and also buttress piles, which provided an innovative solution to conventional propping and allowed for a more open working area, creating cost and program savings for the development. We also carried out raft analyses and a detailed hydrogeological risk assessment. So just some slides here from our hydro risk assessment. We built this model in Plaxis 3D, which is finite elements of soil structure interaction program. So we gathered data from available LiDAR data, as well as incorporating data from contour plots from our on-site groundwater data observations and contour plots of the Wadhurst clay formation that we'd seen on site. Those were input to the model. An initial phase was run where there was no obstruction to the flow down the slope. And then we ran another phase where that impermeable basement was incorporated. And from this, we were looking at the head build up against the secant wall, the impacts on the retaining wall design from that, and also impacts to neighbouring properties with basements in the area. Another large aspect of our design work was carrying out the retaining wall design. So we carried this out again in Plaxis 3D with additional verifications using 2D software Wallop. And this, we created a large number of individual sections which were around the proposed basement area, and those were individually informed by the local site conditions that we saw. So on those, we were varying the strata levels, varying parameters, the surcharges, making them really local based on the ground model that we put together. And in these as well, we were incorporating potential hazards that we'd seen, such as softened layers of soil at the top of the Wadhurst clay formation, acting as potential slip surfaces. So that was modelled as just a half a metre of soil with residual strength to see the impact that that could have on the secant pile retaining wall that we were designing. That's where I'll wrap it up. I've not been watching the time, so hopefully that's about right. But in summary, we carried out a case study. The paper summarises a case study that we carried out for developing an engineering ground model and its use for proposed development. It helped us develop a good understanding of the geotechnical hazards to investigate in the field work and informed the scope of that phased investigation. and then fed into detailed design and analysis work. So yeah, I'll finish there, and thank you. If anyone's got any questions.
Great, thank you, Madeline. I can't see any questions at the moment, so unless any of our panelists have any immediate questions now, I think I'd suggest that if any attendees do have questions, pop it in the Q&A, and Madeline can answer your questions during the next talks or afterwards. Thank you. Okay. So moving on to our final prize winner, we move on to the Early Career Researcher Award for the Journal of the Geological Society, and that is Anthony Shilito from the University of Oxford. So I will pass over to Anthony now.
Great. I will share that. Hopefully that's all working. Great. Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for a couple of great talks so far. I'll try not to drop the ball and standard high. And thank you for the to the Journal of the Geoscience for choosing me for this prize. So I'm going to talk about my paper about the Silurian inception of inland desert ecosystems. So evidence from using trace fossils from when we first start to see animals moving into inhabiting desert environments. So I'll try and touch on a bit of the background and what we knew before about what was living in deserts, and then we'll kind of move on to look more specifically at the Mourinho sandstone and what that tells us about how that changes the picture. So deserts are not typically associated with life. They're generally considered as inhospitable environments where nothing survives, as you can see from this picture from the Namib desert in Namibia. However, these places aren't totally devoid of life, and we do have fully functioning ecosystems. There are lots of small arthropods and things which occupy these settings. So in fact, Aeolian environments contain the earliest evidence for animal life out of the ocean, so animals on land. You can see in the image on the left here, we have a few trackways crossing this bedding surface. And on the right, this gives some context to kind of the overall facies. So we see these large kind of Aeolian dune deposits. And the ruler is a meter long, so you can see it's a few meters thick, these dunes. And this comes from the Lake Cambrian, the Potsdam group, and it's from a disused quarry close to Kingston, Ontario. And so these traces were first reported back in 2002 by Rob Norton and others. And yeah, that pushed back the age of the first evidence for animal life on the continents. And these were occurring in these windblown deposited environments. However, these were coastal dune fields, so like what we see here from a modern beach in Norfolk, but obviously less vegetated, as we didn't have plant life on land at that point. And it's likely that animals were just making brief excursions out of the oceans this time rather than permanently inhabiting the continents. And this figure from Veronica Krapovikas and others from their 2016 review of Aeolian ichthyofaunas shows that up until the early Paleozoic, all of the known kind of Aeolian ichthyofaunas, so all known evidence of animals in Aeolian settings, was from coastal dune fields, from the Potsdam, the Cambrian, up to the Muff Formation from the Devonian, which shows kind of barrier island dunes. So whilst we've got animals living in these most settings, we don't have them living kind of inland. Evidence before our paper suggested that up until the Devonian, we're only seeing animals that are making excursions out of the sea into these dunes rather than permanently inhabiting them. The previous oldest known established Aeolian ichthyofauna, so the previous oldest evidence for animals permanently living inland in these desert type environments, comes from the Kilmurray Sandstone, which is in the Caherba group in Ireland on the Dingle Peninsula. You can see circled in red here, we have this not particularly clear trackway, but you have to trust me. We have footprints down the side and the meter rule for scale there. And this was studied back in 2012 by Hans Morrissey and others, who summarized the ichnofauna. And we're going to return to so remember the Kilmurray sandstone, because we're going to return to it as a point of comparison with the Mourinho later in the presentation. So the Mourinho sandstone, this beautiful, extensively outcropping formation from Northern Territory in Australia, could provide new insights into earlier life in Aeolian settings, because we have a host of trace fossils showing animal life inhabiting these environments. We've got some, for those of you not as familiar with trace fossils, they're kind of fossilized behavior, if you want. It's footprints and burrows that are preserved in the rock record that record how animals were interacting with the environments they lived in. So an intro to the Mourinho sandstone, of where it is, what it is. It's a 580 meter thick succession of siliciclastic strata, and it consists entirely of very fine to medium grain quartz arenite sandstones. Was deposited in the Amadeus Basin in Northern Territory, and it cropped in Australia, and crops out as well as well-exposed escarpments, plateaus, and buttes in Wataka National Park. And this is a kind of overview map to show where that was. So we have, the national park related to Alex Springs and Uluru, and then some close-ups of the significant field areas we went to, mostly in the northeast of the park, and based ourselves in Kings Canyon. So unfortunately, there are no direct age indicators from the formation, but a range of evidence points to a Silurian age. Neighboring stratigraphic units, such as the Stokes siltstone and Park siltstone, can be directly dated with body fossils, so they provide maxima and minima. And paleomagnetic studies have suggested that it was most likely deposited between the early Silurian and early Devonian. So we can place it, we have it in this mystery window here, but it's likely deposited during the Silurian, this window where up until now, we don't have any evidence of animals living in these Aeolian desert environments. To provide some paleogeographic context of what the world was looking like at this time, we have two major continents. We have Laurussia and Gondwana, with some smaller land masses, largely around the tropics. In Australia, our key area was very close to the equator. So the Mourinho sandstone, around about the center of Australia, would have been deposited at very low latitudes. So the other important paleogeographic context, so a more regional scale, and that's the Larpentine Seaway. So the Larpentine Seaway was a pan-continental seaway thought to have existed through the Ordovician during the deposition of the Larapinta group, which is the group which underlay the Mourinho sandstone. So preceding deposition of the Mourinho sandstone, large areas were uplifted due to the Alice Springs orogeny. Oh dear, sorry about that. And the margins of the remnants of the seaway retreated to the east. As you can see here, the seaway going across the entire continent and then gradually retreating away between the upper Ordovician and the Silurian. So these orogenic topographic highs may also explain why we might be able to see desert conditions in an area so close to the equator. So a latitude where in modern environments, we'd expect kind of tropical climate and high biodiversity. However, we do see some modern deserts at similar latitudes, and these are associated with kind of regional topographic highs, which provide a rain shadow, such as in some kind of small South American deserts caused by the rain shadow of the Andes, or in African equatorial deserts, some like one of which is caused by the rain shadow of Kilimanjaro. So the evolution of the seaway and the subsequent changes to the landscape provide important context for how the area was changing before and during deposition of the Mourinho sandstone, and it might help us to explain why we see what we do. So for geological context, for Mourinho sandstone, there are two facies. We have the cross-bedded and a flat-bedded facies. Cross-bedding occurs in sets up to 3 meters thick. Sandstone is extremely compositionally and texturally mature. Many of the grains have frosted veneers, and thin pinstripe lamination occurs in some beds. So this is interpreted as aeolian dunes. And what we know about the dunes is dunes where the dominant flow direction recorded from the bedding surfaces is west-southwest to southeast-east. We have a wide range of flow directions reported from it, but it's very dominant towards the south. And the dunes also appear to have a low angle of climb measured from the bounding surfaces between the sets. Most significantly, though, as we'll see through comparison with the interdune facies, is that there are no trace fossils known from any of these dune deposits. Although there are very few bedding surfaces, which may explain why we're not seeing some of these things, but it does appear that animals were largely not inhabiting these dune facies settings. The flat-bedded facies records interdune deposits, and what we know about these is that they were intermittently wet. We can see this from looking at surface textures. So we see structures like adhesion marks, which suggests that the surface was damp and has been exposed subaerially, so that dry sand, when it's blown across, then adheres to the wet substrate, causing these this bobbly texture. We also have evidence of wave ripples and then ladder ripples, which shows that, again, we've had a submerged substrate where the water level has fallen, and evidence of drainage. There are some sand crack features, again, showing drying, and then raindrop impressions revealing substrates which were fully subaerial exposed. We also see a wide range of trace fossils. All of the trace fossils known from the formation occur within these facies. And I will go into a little bit more detail in all of what we see in a second. So combining this geological information, we can assemble an approximate depositional model where we see emergent interdunes with ephemeral ponds and extensive aeolian dunes. We think that the damp interdunes are a function of the elevated water table, and this facies variability could be due to a progressive, so we have expanding interdunes upsection. So we're getting thicker packs of this intermittently damp sediment. Could either be due to progressively wetter climate, but it also could be due to the development of the aeolian system. So we maybe will be seeing the truly incipient aeolian environment at the start as the seaway retreats away and all the underlying formations were more marine. So we're seeing the true onset of aeolian sedimentation. And then as we go up section, as the dunes get bigger, they get further apart and the interdunes become more extensive. So it's an overview of the ichnofauna, so the trace fossils we see in the formation. We have a range of horizontal and vertical burrows and superficial markings and trails and tracks. So we have Helminthopsis, Didymalignus, Diplonites, this trackway here. Paleophycus, a short horizontal burrow, a larger vertical burrow, Levosiclus, and then some burrow tops, either individual, which may record Scolithos, or paired, which might all be Arenicolites. We have this trace here, which is a personal favorite, which I think is highly significant to the overall story of the terrestrialization process, called Polarichnus, and a burrow with this radial markings around the side are reported by Guramanis and McLaughlin in 2016. And these traces, you can see we've clearly got a range of animals producing these traces, as you can see from the variability in the size of traces. We have fairly large, wide trackways. The black scale bar is 10 centimeters and the red is 1. So we have, yeah, some large trackways and some large burrows, but some very small things as well. And these traces mostly occur individually, just as a single isolated trace on the surface, but there are several associations that stand out. The first of which is centered around polar ichneus, and multiple bedding planes contain between 1 or 8 specimens, but no other trace fossils. And these burrows are often associated with emergent sedimentary structures, such as adhesion marks. And so, as I mentioned, polar ichneus, I think, it's a recurring theme in recent talks I've given, and I think that's because it's so significant in our understanding of the terrestrialization process. So shallow U-shaped burrow, but it only occurs in a very narrow window from the Silurian to the early Devonian, and it only occurs in emergent settings. So this trace appears to be firmly tied to what's going on when animals are first moving onto land, either as it may well be a behavior that has been adapted to deal with the novel conditions that animals are facing, and then has been replaced, or the taxa that were experimenting with this behavior ended up not permanently colonizing the continents, so that behavior then disappeared from the record. So other than the polar ichneus beds, we have 2 main surfaces with trace fossil associations. This dominated by large vertical and U-shaped burrows, and it may record the fauna within an ephemeral pond. So we have 1 polar ichneus also preserved on this surface, which may be a result of overprinting as the pond dried and emerged. The other association, again, is dominated by a range of vertical and horizontal burrows. But these burrows here are significantly smaller, and again, may well record an ephemeral pond fauna. So when we put it all together, this is the picture that we get. We want to think about, what does this ichnofauna say about the first things living in Aeolian settings? And then ask, how does this differ from the picture that we got from the Kilmurray sandstone? So in comparing it with the Kilmurray, see that actually it differs quite a lot. And whilst the environment is interpreted as being pretty similar, although the Kilmurray interdunes were fluvial influenced rather than water table controlled, there are major differences. First of which is that the Kilmurray has traces in dunes as well as interdunes. The key differences occur in these 3 architectural styles, which only occur in one setting. And more so, which could be due to being more established Middle Devonian ichnofaunas has a variety of kind of meniscate burrow traces. The less established Silurian system instead has an abundance of U-shaped burrows, an ethology which is often associated with refugia. It could be one of the differences. We could be seeing these differences for several reasons, but I think the main one is time. The second is that we're on different sides of the world with these formations. So we could see different developmental patterns on Gondwana or Laurentia. And we're also seeing lower diversity in the fluvial dominated interdunes than we are seeing in the groundwater dominated. And ichnofaunas are known to be absent or restricted in high energy fluvial settings until much later than low energy kind of submerged terrestrial settings. Instead, the ichnofauna is much more comparable to the Stairway Sandstone, which is an underlying formation, if you remember, but deposited in the marine waters of the Larpentine Seaway. Unsurprisingly, the Stairway ichnofauna is far more diverse, but most of the key groups in the Mourinho Sandstone also occur in the Stairway. Main difference is the absence of kind of horizontal branching burrows, so things like Ophrophycus and Phycodes, suggesting that we could have a lack of systematic deposit feeders in the Mourinho Sandstone, which could be explained by the difference in depositional setting. You're having nutrients refreshed far more frequently on tidal flat type environments than you are in a desert. The second difference is the appearance of polar ichneus in the Mourinho Sandstone, which is again likely related to the difference in depositional environment, but also because the polar ichneus producing behavior doesn't appear to have emerged by the time the Stairway was being deposited. And this cartoon is just to illustrate the stairway environment and show how different it is to what we're hypothesizing for the Mourinho sandstone. We're in the same location at a different time, and we're seeing very different environments. But why are we seeing similarities between the ignotfaunas? And this is where things get a little bit more hypothetical, and this is an area that I'm hoping to do a little bit more work on in the future. We see this cartoon shows the progression from the Seaway sandstone to the Mourinho sandstone, and how the environment at this physical geographic point will have changed through time. And as the kind of Larpentine Seaway is closing and we're getting regional uplift, this area is drying out, being a major unconformity, and finally the area is fully terrestrial. And one possible hypothesis is that the stairway fauna is the source fauna for the Mourinho sandstone. As I said, we're going to need a little bit more work and more investigation of the I think it's Carmichael sandstone in between to truly kind of understand if this is the case. So to wrap up, the Silurian Mourinho sandstone was most likely deposited in a wet inland kind of environment, or a damp inland environment. We're seeing fairly large dunes and interdunes inhabited by a low diversity of invertebrates. And these animals were adapting to and dealing with stressful conditions through a range of behavioral strategies, such as polyrectness, burying itself shallowly below the surface to deal with desiccation. And this is now the oldest known example of an inland kind of Aeolian fauna, pushing dates back from the mid-Devonian, where the Kilmore sandstone was seen. It's possible that some of the existing shallow marine fauna may have kind of adapted to and exploited local environmental change at the onset of terrestrialization, but this is going to require more investigation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Really nice visual presentation. I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A. Let me give it one last check. I haven't, no. So if you have any questions for Anthony, then I'm sure he will be very happy to answer afterwards via email. Once again, thank you all for your presentations. I know it's always a really difficult decision for our editors to choose the winners, but it's always a very enjoyable endeavour. So once again, a huge congratulations to all of our prize winners. And I will now pass over to Professor Rob Strachan, who is the Society's Publication Secretary, to wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much, Maggie. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I am Rob Strachan and I'm Publications Secretary for the Geological Society. I'd like to propose a huge vote of thanks to all of you who have contributed this afternoon, and also acknowledge the activities and continued success of the publishing house. As Maggie summarised at the start, publishing activities continue to go from strength to strength over the last year, despite the extremely challenging circumstances. And as you've heard, there are clear development plans for the way forward in 2022. I thank our project leaders of the Society's scientific themes for their informative presentations, which I'm sure will serve to focus our scientific activities and deliver real societal change further down the line. Particular congratulations are due to our 3 prize winners. Thanks so much for your really excellent presentations. And I hope that these awards are early stepping stones on the way to stellar academic and professional careers. The success of our publishing activities depends upon a huge number of people: the chief editors of our journals, the members of the editorial boards, the reviewers of papers and book proposals, committee members, and once papers and books are accepted, there is then the hard work put in by the team at the publishing house. On behalf of the Society, I'd like to thank you all for your input, which continues to sustain a publishing operation, which is the envy of many geoscience societies worldwide. Thank you so much. With that, I will hand back over to Maggie.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. So a huge thank you to all of our editorial collaborators. Publishing is, of course, an important part of the Society's mission, and without you all, it really wouldn't be possible. So a huge thank you. I hope to see you all this time next year, and also at any conferences. So if you are going to EGU, we'd be really happy to see you. Thank you once again, and this is the end. Thank you.